G'day guys, Adam Cogan here at NDC Sydney, right near the end of the conference. It's been an awesome conference and I have Jake Ginnivan here. How are you, Jake?
Pretty good.
We are going to talk all things Angular.
Just my favourite subject.
It's up your alley, that's good to hear. All right, why is Angular more popular than React?
Is this going to be how we play it, eh? It's not. Depends on your community, I think.
Do you know which one's more popular?
No, I don't particularly care. I am pretty heavily invested in the React community, and just having a community around a particular project is pretty important, I reckon.
So Angular got real popular, Angular JS.
It did.
People saw performance problems with it. Why did React get popular?
So I think React has a few things going for it. One, it was a homegrown project inside Facebook, so they were using it for many years and building stuff with it before they actually turned it into a project and open sourced it for the community. Whereas Angular, I think, had a very different way of working. Facebook wanted to create, Google wanted to create a framework that would help them build web applications, but that didn't really get much traction internally for quite a while. It did get a lot of traction in the community. So I think Facebook, and I like the way they did that. Grow it, prove it, release it. The community then rallied around that. It also was brought quite a few novel concepts like the virtual DOM, which we hadn't seen in a web framework before. And since then, there's been a heap of projects that have followed suit and sort of gone down that virtual DOM path.
With React on a greenfield project,
Yeah.
why would you choose React over Angular for a fresh project?
It's simplicity. So as you said, Angular the way it tends to work is it's really nice, gets you started, has everything you need out of the box. It has a HTTP library, dependency injections, patterns to do testing. It gives you all of that stuff. Yeah, TypeScript. TypeScript works great with React, by the way. We're using TypeScript in React. But over time, you need to understand how Angular works internally, because especially in Angular 1, you'd kind of get to the point that you had too many watches and the digest loops were taking too long, so you had to know how to change the implementation of your application to drop those down to make Angular perform well again. React kind of takes a different approach to that. They wanted to make it so the library could make good decisions about how to perform well. So you declare the way you want it to work using methods like setState to say, I want this state to change. And it's up to React to decide when to actually do the re-render. So over time, once again, it can get slower, and then React gives you some really good escape hatches to improve your performance. So you can just give it hints that it shouldn't re-render this subsection of the app. So to go back to the original question, the reason I would pick React for a greenfield project now is I can continue building the application, and when I hit a point that it's not performing very well, I can get my application back on track without sort of having to do really large rewrites or refactoring.
Right. Fair enough. But with those comparisons you were using, that was against Angular JS. Angular 2 and React are pretty on par, right? So in performance terms.
Yeah, they've changed the internal state management models for React, so it's now built on top of RxJS. With the switch to Rx, I haven't used Angular 2 in production, or in anger really, so I can't go too deep into this, but my understanding is when you're using something like an observable-based UI, if you are triggering too many state updates, it's up to you to conflate, to like debounce or throttle to make sure that you're not spamming the UI. and having performance problems there. So once again, it comes back to the user of the framework to improve the performance of the app.
What is the reason it's called React, and what is the difference between React and Reactive?
Interesting question. I'm not sure why it's called React, because it has nothing to do with reactive programming. For me, like libraries like RX with reactive programming are about treating data as streams, and everything's a stream, and you can perform asynchronous operations on those streams, so you can filter them and map them and join them and that sort of thing. React is a declarative UI library, which I'm not actually sure why it's called React.
It's not all based on state change.
Yeah, so it kind of, the way I described React in my presentation yesterday was it's kind of modeled similar to a game loop where there's some input, then new state, like the world state is changed, and then it just re-renders your application. I think maybe I don't know.
What's Redux?
What's Redux? Redux is a state management library which was born out of the React community again. It solves some interesting problems around, in a React application, you can end up with a really deep tree of components, right? If you're not using something like Redux, you pass state through all of the levels, and then you bubble events back up. Data flow is really explicit. What Redux does is gives you a single store where you hold all of your application state inside a single state atom. That allows you to then connect to that store at any point in your Redux application without having to pass the data up and down the tree. So yeah, it's a library that facilitates having a single place to store all your state.
Okay. So we talked about greenfield projects before, and why you like it, and I'm just wondering, is there a difference in making a decision over Angular and React in a brownfield project?
I think React is easier to justify in a brownfield project because it has a lot less in it than Angular. Angular does lend itself to building the entire application in Angular, and it kind of owns it. React, it's quite common to just build a single component and host just that single component inside a more complicated application. So the migration path between Angular 1 and 2 is kind of, well, we'll start building Angular 2 components and host them inside Angular 1 components and then kind of grow out. You can use that pattern in React, and I've seen it a couple of times where companies have used Angular to build the entire application, and then they've had a problem because they've got a really complicated grid with a lot of updates, which React is better at solving those problems. So they've just rebuilt that component in React and hosted it within the Angular app. So in a brownfield project, it's much easier to sort of just build little bits over time.
So I think in all circumstances you would choose React for all applications.
Pretty much.
Yeah, because you like it. So the history has been that, you know, Angular JS was super popular, or new projects start with that. React got popular. Angular 2 became popular again. What's going to be the next one? Like, how long do you think you'll be doing React before the next new project won't be React?
Unsure. I don't think it'll be the solution forever. Like I think in the web industry, if you get sort of 3 or 4 years on a single technology, that's pretty amazing. I think if I was to move to something beyond React, I would move to something that had a similar conceptual model. I find it just easier to rationalize what's happening in my application. I used to come from WPF land and MVVM and data binding and sort of those patterns, and looking back, I wish I had something that had the same sort of mental models that come along with React. You're much more likely to sort of be thinking similar to an MVC server-side application. And if you can keep your thinking around that, where I've got my state, in an MVC application, you fetch it from the database, you throw it at your arrays of views, it renders the app, and then you kind of forget about it. It's all stateless. If you can have the same mental model with React. So I would be looking for a library that had that similar mental model.
Well, you could always do Windows Universal Platform, UWP.
Yeah. I think Microsoft did release React Native bindings for UWP.
Did they?
At some point, I think.
You should check them out.
Yeah.
Sharing components. So you saw we have this beautiful Sophie application downstairs, and when you look at it, you see all these widgets populate essentially. Those widgets, some of them are great. I would love to share them on another application, or we have an Office 365 intranet. I'd love to, I've built that widget.
Yep.
Can I share it over there? You got any experience with sharing widgets or web parts or whatever you want to call them?
Yep.
Between different applications?
Yeah, so we have built up a component library because over time we don't just want to rebuild the west.com.au. We want to create a whole heap of different sites.
What's the URL?
Thewest.com.au.
That's where you work?
Yep, I work at the West Australian newspapers in Perth on the new digital platform, and so...
And it's all React?
It's all React, server-side rendered. What we would like to do is, as we mature our platform, is we can actually hopefully use React and like a rich JavaScript app to do more interactive storytelling rather than just plain text articles and that sort of thing. So hoping to leverage the power of JavaScript apps to do that. So yeah, we have a component library that allows us to build self-contained components and share them around between different applications. The React community, because they've come from, a lot of the ideas were based in Node, and sort of small modules that are reusable can be published to NPM. You can just install them and use it similar to the way you'd share a NuGet library. The React community is already doing this. There's a GitHub repo called, I think it's Awesome React Links or something along those lines, and it has, here are a bunch of really good like tab control components, here's some really good charting components, and they're all just open source on NPM. So it's quite easy to just pull out a component and publish it to NPM, and anyone can consume it.
Very nice, very nice. The React team, have they given you everything you want, or is there some things you would love? Tell us what they are.
There's a bunch of things that are coming in the current beta of React 16, that I've been wanting for a very long time. The first one is fragments. So a React component currently can only return a single element. The side effect of that is because every component can only return one thing, nearly every component wraps what it actually wants to return in divs. So you end up with just way more divs than you actually would want in your application. I've wanted to not have to do that for ages. The other one is error boundaries. So when things go wrong in your application and it throws when it's trying to actually do a render, you can now put an error boundary in, which allows you to essentially catch the render error and then render a something went wrong component or something along those lines. So those are two things that I've wanted for ages. Everything else is, you can probably get it off NPM. So React will continue just doing what it does, and unlike Angular, which is one of the downsides of React, is it is this lowest common denominator, provides sort of the basics, and then outside of that, once you want to solve other problems like HTTP or testing, you have to go outside to other libraries.
Right, okay. With Office 365 and SharePoint 2016, developing web parts or widgets for them, is all based on open web technologies.
Yep.
Almost everyone is doing them in React. A few people are doing them in Angular. Those, have you ever heard of anyone sharing widgets that they develop for Office 365 into other applications? Because it sounds like it's going to be something that's possible.
I haven't. But as long as the component isn't actually tied to Office 365 itself, it just gets past props, then it should be quite reusable. There was an interesting talk yesterday by one of the developers at Domain, Jess. He was talking about how they built all of these reusable components, and then they've built a server-side render microservice. So you can just point at this renderer service, give it the package name, which is the packaged up component, the version, and then pass a bunch of props to it, and it will render that component for you and give you the markup as a result. So I'd imagine that if you had a similar sort of model, you'd be able to publish these components that would be reusable in all of these different contexts.
Right. Are you familiar with Polymer?
I am, yeah.
So, oh, great. So Polymer, the concept of the browsers supporting widgets and you building those, and what do you think of Polymer? What do you think the future will be?
Yeah, so web components is an interesting proposition. There's a couple of things that landed in HTML5 around the shadow DOM, which allows you to essentially build these web components, which is, think of it like a zip file that has CSS, markup, and JS in a single reusable widget that you can use in the DOM. React and web components actually go quite well together and are quite complementary, because the thing about React is it's more about explicit state flows and managing state in your application. But you could build a reusable web component and consume it inside your React component and use React for the state management side. Polymer itself, I've seen some really cool demos around progressive web apps and making it really, really fast and only rendering, requiring exactly what it needs. The Polymer site itself is pretty impressive. I think going forward, Polymer just, when I looked at it last, it didn't have the browser support, and it was pretty heavy to polyfill to get all of that support. But going forward, all of the bits that made web components possible are being reused and leveraged in all of these different frameworks. So
it sounds awesome, doesn't it?
Yeah, the future of the web will be interesting.
Moving on to mobile.
Yes.
What's the 7 West mobile story? Using React Native, or what are you doing?
We are. A month or two ago, we released the news app, and it's all built on React Native. We released it for iOS and Android, and it's been pretty interesting. Tell us, what was the development cycle like? Was it painful, easy? There is still, React Native has its issues. Mainly, it's still evolving, it's still very new, and the community's still playing around with a lot of patterns. So we, halfway through, had to rebuild the way we did navigation, because the library that we chose originally has now been superseded, and those sort of issues that I think Xamarin had a lot of the same issues when they were pretty early. But the flip side of it, the developer experience is amazing. So you can set it up so you've got your app running on your phone, you save on your terminal or in your text editor. It does automatic compilation behind the scenes and ships the update to your app over Wi-Fi. You don't even have to run a compilation step and redeploy the app. It just applies the changes live. The developer experience of that is phenomenal, whereas if you've come from something like Xamarin, where you've got to save, rebuild, deploys it, restarts the app, the cycle time of that's really quite terrible.
Right.
You can get similar sort of nice developer experiences with things like Ionic, and but they are building web apps, essentially, that give you access to native APIs. React Native is using JavaScript and projecting to native components, because React itself is not actually tied to the browser. It can render to sort of any different platform.
Oh, so you're saying that you can do React Native and you will see it in environments other than iOS and Android?
Yeah, so there's React Native Web. So that allows you to build a React Native app that renders to like a website or React or iOS or Android.
So, and some random one you've never heard of in China, Baidu or something?
Yeah, you could. I think Microsoft a while ago, they got React Native working for Windows Phone.
Right.
And I haven't seen where that's gone, but yeah, you can just add additional providers into it. That's not trivial, but possible. And there's some really interesting renderers in React 16. My talk yesterday was on what is React Fiber, and it's the code name for the new reconciliation engine in React. But essentially what version 16 does is it pulls the two core parts of React apart. You've got the renderer side, which is like React DOM or React Native or React VR. And then you have the reconciler, which is the virtual DOM diffing sort of engine that powers React. So all of these different rendering targets use the same reconciler. Do you have designers at, like, do you work? Yeah.
We have some designers, yes.
Yeah, so Airbnb are doing some really cool things with these new renderers. What they're doing is their component library can render to Sketch. So all of their components in their design system and their component library, you can render it out to a Sketch document, which the designers can then rapidly use to prototype.
Nice.
And it kind of, there's a lot of other tools that approach it the other way. You start in the design tool and then you kind of export code out of that, but it's really hard to complete that loop. So because you can plug in additional renderers, you can write these components that can be used on your website in React Native for your mobile apps, and also your designers can output them to Sketch.
Wow.
Pretty interesting scenarios.
That sounds really cool.
Yeah.
Well, this has been fantastic talking to you, Jake. We've got some guys that want to ask some questions. Looks like it. Okay, we got...
I wanted to thank you that you've answered the questions fantastically. I have a question for you about TypeScript versus Flow and why you chose TypeScript.
Yep.
Considering that Flow is from Facebook and supposed to work great with React. I haven't used it personally.
Yeah, it's a really good question. So when we built our team, we decided to not standardize on Macs or not Windows, so we had a mix of both. And when we started, Flow just didn't work very well on Windows, which we did try it, but it ended up just being not a valid choice. Well, most of those problems, I think, have been fixed now, but we're pretty invested in TypeScript. That said, the reason I would pick Flow is if you're converting from a JavaScript application across and you wanted to get typing, Flow is much better at inferring the types. The way it works is it actually builds up a graph of all of the calls in your code base and figures out like the common types of the parameters and then enforces typing across your entire code base. TypeScript, on the other hand, is AST based, where if you haven't explicitly typed things, it doesn't give you a lot of help. So going from an untyped JavaScript application, running Flow on that will give you a lot of value really, really quickly. But on a large application, Flow slows down unless you start explicitly typing, so you'll start explicitly typing over time. And at that point, I love TypeScript as a language, but I haven't used Flow in anger.
Awesome. So let's see if there's any other questions. No? All right, we'll take another question. But while he's coming up to the to the mic, I just want to do a shout out to your boss. Your boss, Joe Hardy. I don't know if you know the whole story, but I met Joe when he was 13. Now, I didn't know he was 13. We were doing a beta 1 application of .NET. And we were going live on beta 1 and having problems with ASMX web services. There's only one other guy with an AU address on the internal Microsoft support channels. And there he is helping me. I email him and say, are you an Aussie? He goes, yeah, I'm from Armidale. Okay, fantastic. How do I do this? How do I do that? And he's helping me along. And then I said, like a month or so later, I said, I'm going up to our farm up in the Hunter Valley. I might swing by and say hello. He goes, sure, I'll ask my dad. I'm only 13. His dad gets on the line. Just this guy been chatting to me on the internet. Anyway, we meet up. He comes and works in Sydney, and the rest is history. Now he's in Perth working.
Yeah,
working for him.
He's done a great job building an awesome team over there. It's it's a pretty exciting opportunity to be able to sort of. I was loving working for Redify and the opportunity to sort of work with Joe and build up this like digital strategy for a media organization was just pretty cool. Awesome. So, yeah.
Let's take this last question.
So have you tried MobX or something else as an alternative to Redux? And what's your preferred state management in React applications right now?
Yeah, so that half of that cut out. So the question was around, have you heard or used MobX, which is a alternate library to Redux, and what's your preferred? Currently we're using Redux. I would, if I wasn't using server-side rendering, I would push as far as you can using just React and set state, because it works really, really well. It doesn't have a lot of overhead in terms of sort of ceremony. As soon as you go to something like Redux, you have to build reducers and then dispatch actions, and there's a lot more overhead to just implement a simple feature. It does give you a lot of other benefits, but yeah, I'd go as far as you can just using something like set state, and then once you hit the limitations of that, then start investigating state management libraries. I haven't used MobX. I've heard good things.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Jake.
Cheers.
It's been fantastic. And this is Adam Cogan signing off for SSW TV.